Welcome to The Explainer. For centuries, faith and science have often felt like they're in completely different worlds. But what if they're not? Today, we're diving deep into that intersection. We're talking about the neuroscience of belief. What's actually going on inside our heads during a spiritual moment? So let's start with a pretty bold statement from Sigmund Freud. He called religion the universal obsessional neurosis of humanity, a shared delusion. Whoa. And for a long time, that was kind of the mainstream view in psychiatry, right? The idea was that faith was just a psychological crutch, something to be analyzed, not taken seriously as a core part of the human experience. It really pushed faith over here and science way over there. But here's the thing. That whole shared delusion idea bumps up against a massive reality. Today, a staggering 90% of the world's population is involved in some kind of religious or spiritual practice. Think about that. We're not talking about a fringe group. We're talking about a fundamental part of life for billions of people. So what do you do with that? If something is that widespread, that important to people, science can't just ignore it. And it hasn't. That big question, what's happening in the brain during these moments, has moved from the philosopher's study right into the science lab. This has kicked off a whole new field, sometimes called neurotheology. All right, so here's our game plan. We'll look at why science even started studying this. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how they do it. We'll see what the brain scans actually show, what this means for our mental health, and finally, try to figure out what it all adds up to. First up, why did science even get into this? Well, it's pretty simple, really. When you have a phenomenon that shapes the lives, cultures, and histories of billions of people, you just can't ignore it. It became a question science had to ask. Okay, so before we can really dig into what scientists are finding, we've got to talk about how they're finding it. Let's look at the tools of the trade. First things first, let's get our terms straight because it's a really important distinction. Think of religion as the organized structure, the institution, the community, the specific set of beliefs and practices. Spirituality is more personal. It's that individual search for meaning, for connection to something bigger than yourself. You can have one without the other, and for scientists, separating these two is absolutely key. All right, tool number one, the MRI. The easiest way to think about an MRI is like a high-resolution photograph of your brain's anatomy. It shows us all the physical structures, the layout of the land, so to speak. It's a static map. Now, this is where it gets really cool. The fMRI, or functional MRI, takes that static map and turns it into a live weather report. It tracks blood flow. Why? Because when a part of your brain is working hard, it needs more oxygen, so more blood rushes there. The fMRI sees that rush of blood and shows us in real time which parts of the brain are lighting up during a task. It's the brain in action. And our third major tool is the EEG. If fMRI is great at showing us where something is happening, the EEG is all about when. It measures the brain's electrical activity, that constant buzz of neurons firing, with incredible speed. We're talking milliseconds, so it gives us this super precise timeline of brain activity. Okay, we've got our toolkit. So what happens when we use it? When scientists put people who are praying or meditating or having some kind of spiritual experience into these machines, what do they actually see? And this is fascinating. Whether they're studying Carmelite nuns deep in prayer or Tibetan Buddhists in meditation, a consistent pattern emerges. It's not one little God spot that lights up. No, it's a whole network of different brain regions working together. We see activity in places like the frontal cortex, which helps regulate our emotions, and the precuneus, which is all about self-reflection. And really importantly, the default mode network. That's the part of our brain that hums along when we're thinking about ourselves, our past, and our future. So let's just put this idea to bed right now. The whole concept of a single God spot is pretty much out the window. What the science is showing is that these spiritual moments tap into a bunch of different brain networks. And here's the kicker. These aren't some weird separate spirituality circuits. They're the exact same systems we use for some of our most fundamental human experiences, like empathy, thinking about ourselves, and connecting with other people. So when you look at all the research together, two really big conclusions jump out. First, these experiences aren't just in your head in a vague sense. They have real, measurable, biological effects on the brain. You can actually see the footprint they leave. And second, and this is wild, that footprint looks different from other similar emotional experiences. There's something unique about the brain's response to spirituality. Here is a perfect example of what I mean. One study had devout Christians pray while they were in a scanner. And what did their brains do? They lit up the parts associated with social interaction. In other words, to their brain, talking to God looked an awful lot like talking to another person. It wasn't just thinking thoughts, it was having a conversation. Okay, so this is all really interesting brain science, but does it actually matter in the real world? Oh, yeah. It turns out this brain activity is strongly linked to our mental health, especially when it comes to things like coping and resilience. Let's just look at the data for a second. There was this huge study that followed people for 14 years. It found that people who went to religious services at least once a month were 22% less likely to develop depression than people who never went. And that's even after they controlled for other things, like how much social support people had. And when it comes to suicidality, the numbers are even more dramatic. A massive Harvard study found that women who attended religious services more than once a week had a 5 times lower rate of suicide compared to those who never attended. That is an enormous protective effect. But hold on, it's not quite that simple. It's not like just signing up for a religion automatically makes you healthier. The research is really clear on this. How you relate to your faith matters a lot. Scientists talk about 2 different styles, positive and negative religious coping. And the difference between them is night and day. Positive coping is when you see your faith as a source of support. You feel connected to a loving, benevolent higher power. That's consistently linked to better mental health. But negative coping, or what's called religious struggle, is the flip side. It's when you feel punished, abandoned, or angry at God. And that, unfortunately, is linked to much worse outcomes, like more depression and higher anxiety. All right, let's pull all of this together. We've seen some amazing findings, but what do we actually make of them? It's time to talk about what we know, what we don't, and what it all really means. Now, it's super important to be clear about something. This science is still young. The researchers who are doing this work are the first people to tell you that there are challenges. This isn't settled science. It's an exciting, developing field. So what are those challenges? Well, for one, a lot of studies have pretty small sample sizes. It can be tough to find good control groups. The very definition of religious or spiritual can change from study to study. And maybe the biggest one, most of this shows a correlation, a link between 2 things. It doesn't prove that one causes the other. And that brings us to maybe the single most important point of this entire explainer. This research is not about finding God in the brain. It can't prove or disprove God or the soul or the afterlife. That's not what science does. What it is doing is trying to understand the human side of the equation, the neural activity that happens when a person believes. It's the science of the experience itself. So in the end, where does this leave us? As we learn more and more about the neuroscience of belief, it forces us to ask some pretty deep questions about ourselves. It seems to suggest that our brains, the very biology of who we are, might be wired for meaning, for connection, for reaching towards something beyond ourselves. It's a glimpse into one of the most ancient and powerful forces that makes us human, and that is a search worth continuing.